Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. After the Second World War, the world realized the urgent need in preventing another global catastrophe. Thus, the United Nations was founded in 1945. The primary responsibility adopted by the United Nations body is to ensure international peace and security. But according to the UN's own figures, the world is witnessing the highest displacement ever on record. The UN reports that in 2017, 16.2 million people across the globe were displaced due to violence, persecution, or conflict. This number is expected to rise as conflicts ranging from Yemen to Kashmir seem to have no end in sight. In light of this, it is imperative to ask that after 74 years of its existence, what real relevance and power does the United Nations have in establishing and maintaining global peace? On tonight's show, we try to find out. We're joined by Lieutenant General Maqsood Ahmed, who's a former military advisor for peacekeeping operations of the United Nations, joining us today. We're also joined by Qazi Saleem, who's a diplomat and Pakistan mission to the United Nations, joining us from Geneva. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Qazi, let me begin with you. In your eyes and in your opinion, what are the key roles the United Nations must play and does play?
I mean, in your introduction, you have rightly pointed out that the UN was formed after a global catastrophe. Before that, there was League of Nations, which failed to actually stop the world leading from World War I to World War II. So after that, it was decided by all the nations around the world that we need to agree on some principles, which is called as the UN Charter, to finally make a system which would stop the world from going into such plummeted situation in future.
Yeah.
So this was the basic point of making the United Nations. But we also have to see the changing world dynamics at that time. The world was going through a process which we all know, it's called decolonization. And that was one of the core elements for the establishment of the United Nations as well.
Yeah.
Now the UN that we see today shows the power structure that was present 70 years back. A lot of things have changed. For example, P5 are there, which shows the power structure that was agreed upon. And but to simplify the things.
So, Mr. Qazi, here, are you trying to say that the UN has not evolved at all from how it was 70 years ago?
Actually, I'll try to explain it in a manner that first, what are our expectations of the UN and how the UN can work. Now, UN has a narrative building role, definitely. It's important. In 70 years, the world has gone quite far ahead on many things, on human rights, on the rights of women, on empowerment, on disabilities rights, and all these things. So that has been the positive story of the UN. But when we talk about conflict resolution, when we talk about the disputes, especially the Kashmir dispute and a few others, then we have to see the problems in the structural issues as well as the political aspects which stopped us from going further ahead and resolving those problems.
Yeah, and Mr. Qazi, I do to build on to what the structural issues are in the United Nations. And for that, I'm going to take my discussion here to Mr. Maqsood Ahmed, who is in the studios with us. Mr. Maqsood, so the UN Charter begins by saying, "We, the people of the United Nations," referring to the 193 member states of the United Nations. But in reality, do you think it is representative of the 193 voices, or is it just representing the interests of a few countries?
Well, thank you, Meshal. I think you aptly said that UN has not probably evolved as it should have been evolved over the period of time. Yes, the 5 permanent members do enjoy the veto power, and they have the overriding impact and effect on the UN policies and decision making. And that effect is reflected in the UN missions across the board when we talk of peace and security also. Now, one vote and one country principle is there in the General Assembly. When it comes to the Security Council, which is the implementation body of the policies of the United Nations, there the overriding veto power is available to 5 members. That is somewhat is not gelling well with the democratic systems which are prevailing in the world at large. Now, how to address this issue? There are a number of ideas floating around, but all those ideas again homing on to giving this veto power to 4 more members, which kills the basic concept of the United Nations. That
how does it kill the basic concept?
Because now what I see when I was there, when I was seeing even the 5 members, it's very difficult to agree on any agenda point. And the resolutions which are being passed now, when the 5 members are clearly divided on certain lines, that no UN resolution is passed unanimously.
Yeah.
And one veto power has the kind of a power to veto any resolution if they don't like it or it goes against their interest. Now, if you increase the veto powers from 5 to let's 7 or 8, that much more complicated the United Nations policy making.
Then there will never be a decision.
There will never be a decision. And if you don't have a unanimous decision in the United Nations, the implementation gets that much weaker.
Yeah. So you talked about here how there are 5 members. Can you also elaborate on how the United Nations Security Council in general operates? What about the non-permanent members? How are they brought into the council, and what is their role?
Now, of course, the non-permanent members, which are 15, they are elected for a period of 2 years, and they do have a vote when the resolution is passed, but they do not enjoy the veto power. And generally, they are also in line with and sync with some of the permanent 5 members. So when it comes to voting in the United Nations Security Council, their vote does matter, but the veto power still remains with the 5 members of the Permanent Security Council.
So I'm going to take this question to Mr. Qazi here as well. Our guest here in the studios, Mr. Maqsood, did state very clearly that the whole purpose of the United Nations seems to be defeated when only 5 member states have veto power. What do you have to say to that? Do you feel like this represents the greatest degree of inequality that could be out there?
So I'll support Maqsood Saab's point of view, but I'll add a few points of my own on this particular aspect. Firstly, Pakistan has a very principled position on the reform of the United Nations, especially the Security Council. We consider that any reform that is done should be holistic. It should not be done in a manner that increases the coffee. We call it a club of specialized status countries. We do not require that anymore. We consider that each country, each state should be treated equally, and the charter principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, right to self-determination, the implementation of these principles should take place. The conflicts that we are seeing today is not because the UN in its even today's form could not function. It can function. The problem lies when any of the countries become belligerent, any of the countries considers themselves above the UN Charter and then take things in their own hand and then come up with some logic to define or to morally make that thing happen. This is the thing, whether it is the concept of R2P, whether it's any other concept. So we have to consider the holistic problem rather than going just on reformation. And that's why Pakistan, even in the United Nations, both in New York and in Geneva, are working with all the other countries. We consider multilateralism as the most important thing that can keep the globalized world in a state of peace and stability. But at the same time, the reforms should not be in a manner that plays at the hands of one group or the other and supports their position. So it has to be seen, each organ of the United Nations has to be seen it's working. And we do consider that the UN, even it's in current form, is performing. Okay, maybe it is debatable, not to the extent which we want, but at the same time, we do not want it to be broken completely.
Okay, so Mr. Qazi, you mentioned here, and before we carry forward, I do want to go back to this point. You mentioned here how some countries think they are above the UN Charter. I wonder here, are you only referring to the P5 countries, or are there other countries you are alluding towards?
No, absolutely. I mean, any country who does not who is member of the UN but does not abide by the UN Charter rules comes under that. I can give you an example of again Kashmir. When there are UN Security Council resolutions, then who is the one not abiding by them? We can give other examples of what's happening what's happening in other countries, especially in the Middle East and in other parts of the world. Wherever there is an issue, when you dig deep into it, you would see that either any one of the countries was acting in a manner that was against the charter principles. Why we talk too much about the charter principles is because these were the ones agreed upon by everyone, even while joining the UN. And they do show us a world where there can be diversity of civilizations and where everybody can coexist together.
So, Mr. Qazi, hold on to that thought. I want to transfer this discussion, the specific example you gave of Kashmir. So we know here, Mr. Maqsood, that many resolutions have been passed on Kashmir. Let's start from 1948, when the first resolution was passed that after the ceasefire there should be a plebiscite. That was not abided by. So where is the United Nations lacking in the case of Kashmir specifically? Why is there no implementation?
Okay, I'll take this question in two parts. Now, first is I think UN is doing a very good job when it wants to stop a conflict or control a conflict. So they formulate a resolution, they pass a resolution, and then they bring a kind of a ceasefire or close to normalcy position where the durable peace could be targeted. But when it comes to the implementation of United Nations resolutions, unfortunately, their record is not very good. And Kashmir is not the only case in point. You have seen dozens of resolutions passed on to the Arab states and the conflict between Israel and the Arabs, which has not been implemented, and they've been flouted, and still those resolutions exist. Kashmir is another point. We have seen United Nations resolutions on Cyprus. We have seen in Western Sahara. We are seeing some of the resolutions now in the case of Sudan and South Sudan also. So when it comes to the implementation, frankly speaking, unless the P5 pushes this too hard, the implementation becomes very doubtful. And secondly, as Mr. Qazi referred to, some of the member states, which are not very, even P5, they do not abide by the UN resolutions. So UN does not have a mechanism, or the P5 doesn't want to evolve a mechanism where they can thrust upon those countries to implement the United Nations resolutions.
So the key thing that I'm going to pick out from your statement is that it does not want a mechanism in place in which they can thrust upon these resolutions on countries. And I'm going to take this last question to Mr. Qazi here. Mr. Qazi, as you heard Lieutenant General Maqsood saying here that they don't want there to be a mechanism in which they can get countries to abide by certain resolutions. Tell us what the problem of that is, especially with countries that are operational and that are embroiled in conflicts.
So I would answer this question in a way that I would first tell that, you know, one is idealism and the other is realism. And we are living in a world where geopolitics as well as political economy plays a main role in the decision making of the states. Now, the world and the UN functions on behalf of the states, and the member states take their positions. If any of the member states does not want to abide by the rules of the engagement, then there are mechanisms given in the UN Charter. UN bodies are there. There are special chapters in the UN Charter that talk about how to function them. But then comes who would implement them. Now, this whole mechanism, and if we talk about P5 as well, they are the main states, or they are the main beneficiaries who came into power after the Second World War and the system that we are living in today. So firstly, they have to abide by their responsibilities, And because the ones who are the builders of the system, if they start breaking it, then what can we expect from the others? Just on Pakistan's role, I would like to highlight one thing, that even from the start of the charter making of the UN, as well as the Declaration of the Human Rights, which came out, Pakistan and its diplomats and its people in the UN had a major important role to play, which is actually appreciated till today by everyone. And we still are supportive of the UN system. At the same time, the world has to, the leaders have to sit together and realize that sooner or later we have to start abiding by the principles, and the conflict resolution, it's a huge thing.
Right.
We can.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Qazi Saleem, for joining us and taking the time to talk to us. Your comments have been noted, and we're going to carry them forward in the discussion here. Something that Mr. Qazi mentioned here was the Human Rights Declaration, which was adopted in 1948, which is seen to be a watershed event. It was supposed to end torture, and it was supposed to end slavery. And he mentioned here, if the P5 countries themselves don't abide by these declarations, what really is the use? And in reference to that, I wonder, when Guantanamo Bay, for instance, still exists, so isn't this a clear violation of these declarations? And doesn't that just show the irony and how all these declarations really don't have practical implications?
Well, again, I think Mr. Qazi said it very clearly. It is the national interest which drives the decisions in the United Nations.
Yeah.
So there will never be a uniform applications of the principles in the entire world. This word is not a very fair word. So it's a kind of it's driven by the interests, driven by the agendas, and when the interests change, the thrust of implementation of the decisions also change. We have a number of countries seen when they had taken a position. The case in point is the Kashmir issue. First 18 years of the UN history, the Security Council was very active trying to implement the UN resolutions. But from 1962 onward, when the Soviet Union, erstwhile Soviet Union, started vetoing the resolutions, the resolve of the Security Council weakened.
Yeah.
And now we have come to stage that the last resolution on Kashmir was passed, I think, after 1971, and thereafter no resolution has been passed. It's even not on the agenda of the Security Council anymore.
Yeah.
So that shows how the attitude and behavior of the P5 changes when the interest changes. The same case applies when we come to the implementations of the humanitarian agendas.
Yeah.
Refugees is a case in point. There will be different kind of standards when it comes to implementing the refugees problem in European countries, and when it comes to the Asian or African countries.
So Mr. Maqsood, hold on to that thought, because we are joined by someone who might be able to shed better light on what the on-ground situation of refugees here is. We're joined by Mr. Asif Munier, who is a migration and displacement specialist, formerly working with the UN agencies in Bangladesh. Thank you so much, Mr. Asif, for joining us. So as you must have heard our guests talking about how there are even double standards when it comes to dealing with the refugee and the migration issues. Could you shed light on that?
Thank you very much. It's very right. The situation is evolving and changing. I think we are passing through a transition phase in terms of migration and refugees. Of course, in Bangladesh, we see the Rohingya refugees, but the Syrian refugees, which is a more recent phenomena, and then again, the global scenario in terms of migration. So in terms of the UN's role, I think it is also going through a transition and needs to be looked into how it compares with, for instance, the NATO provisions for the military presence, or the war on terror, where different allied forces have joined hands in terms of ensuring security or providing some kind of effort for conflict resolution. So
Yeah.
when the UN system had evolved as a peacekeeping force or peacekeeping role, I think that is going through a transition in terms of what it would play, what role it can play in the current scenario, given that it has not always been very successful. If you look at, the conflict or the population of the Palestine refugees and Israel, or even in the subcontinent, they are there, but they're not
So,
there.
Mr. Asif here, when we're talking, and since you can talk to us about the situation in Bangladesh and when it comes to the Rohingya Muslims, can you tell us exactly, now we know the UN condemned what is happening in Myanmar, but what is happening there in preventing the atrocities from continuing? What is happening? What is the fault line here? Where is it lacking?
One of the big issues is that the countries in this region have not signed the Refugee Convention. Having said that, there are provisions within the existing national laws that can apply to some extent, chosen by the government, by the host government, how they apply it. So, in short of the Refugee Convention, in terms of, for instance, UNHCR, their role is limited to the extent the government allows them to operate. For instance, humanitarian support. But in terms of resolving or being involved in the resolution or resolving the conflict, it's again left to the countries themselves. For instance, in this case, one issue was about Myanmar and Bangladesh, they themselves having a bilateral agreement where, in terms of preparation of that bilateral agreement, the UN were not called in. UN were not trusted by the governments, and they were not obliged to.
Why wasn't the UN trusted by the governments here?
National sovereignty, and then the issue that this is a bilateral issue, at least that was the premise. Of course, outside the government, critics have mentioned that this is not, at least for the Rohingya issue, it's not just a bilateral issue. It's a question of identity of a community. But then again, it is about a population who either has come from one country or residing in another country. So it's been left to these two countries. And also at the higher level at the UN, for instance, at the General Assembly or at the Security Council, of course, the issue has been brought forward. But then again, it becomes lukewarm. There are allies either on behalf of Bangladesh or Myanmar, not in terms of the Rohingya issue. And the world community at the UN level could not be unanimous in terms of protecting the rights of the refugees in this case.
Yeah.
So in a way, it is a failure of the system as well.
Yeah. And I wonder here, is that argument very prevalent?
I will cover this topic in two parts. I think UN is doing considerably good job when it comes to humanitarian assistance.
Okay.
Refugees, providing food security, child protection, women empowerment, etc., etc. Their track record is pretty good.
Yeah.
When it comes to conflict prevention or even conflict resolution, then the track record is not very good.
And that's the main.
That's the main cause,
purpose.
because they can control a situation, they can control a conflict, but they cannot resolve a conflict, which requires a very dedicated and long effort, consistent effort from all the P5, unanimous kind of a decision. That's where we are lacking. That's why you see some of the resolutions which were passed back in 1948, like resolution between Israel and Palestine, or even 1948 between Pakistan and India. So they're still unresolved.
And can you elaborate on the Israel-Palestine issue a little bit here and the relation that goes on in the United Nations? What happens whenever that is brought up? What happens when resolutions are tried to be passed?
When the State of Israel was created in, I think, as a result of a General Assembly voting, I think in 1948, and two states were created, then a UN mission was also deployed between the two countries to control the situation, what we call is United Nations Truce Observation Commission, something like that. So that mission is still there. And the conflict goes on. It has taken many dimensions.
And the U.S. continuously seems to use its veto power when it comes to the issue of defending Israel.
Sometimes they do use that, and sometimes they don't use it, depending upon the resolution, what kind of language is there in the resolution. So generally,
but it does seem to defend.
They defend it because they are this kind of their state policy that they will defend the interest of Israel. It's in their constitution. So they abide by that, and they do veto that. But where I'm coming to that, the conflicts where there are, they're not being resolved permanently.
Yeah.
Not that they're not success stories, but there are a lot of failures also.
So, Mr. Maqsood, when we return from the break, I'd like to discuss the peacekeeping missions of the United Nations further with you and our other guest, Mr. Asif Munier. But before that, we're going to take a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we continue our discussion regarding the United Nations and its role, we're now also joined by Uluc Ozulker, who is a former ambassador joining us from Istanbul. Thank you so much, Mr. Uluc, for joining us. We were talking about the politics related with the United Nations, and something I want to talk to you about is regarding its funding and how the funding impacts the decisions made within the body. Could you tell us about that?
First of all, I need to emphasize one point. Since 19th century, after the introduction of state-nation knowledge in the world, we are living in every century that we have passed a breakthrough. In 19th century, there were 5 or 6 empires leading the world and deciding everything all around. In the 20th century, after the First World War, the situation has changed, and we've gone into a internationalization of the situation, and we created new institutions to start with the Society of Nations, and the United Nations, a continuation of that. But in the 21st century, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think that we have a new break in front of us, and we're actually living this process. This process is ending up somewhere, but we don't know yet what it will bring to us. So the first point that I would like to underline is that the United Nations, as much as the other international organizations, if they are not renewed or reconstructed or whatever you say, it's not possible for them to govern the world in the 21st century conditions. Now the technology and the everything is changing so rapidly that it is no more possible for any international institution to govern the situation and the problems or solve the problems with the mentality of the 20th century. It's far behind us, and we need to renew everything in front.
Mr. Uluc, so you're mentioning the renewal of the system, and that does take us to the point of reforms, and especially when we talk about the P5 and how the permanent 5 members, what needs to be done there. What, in your opinion, are the reforms that should be introduced to curtail their powers or to renew the system?
First of all, I need to give an answer to your question that you posed on me in the beginning. This is yet another sickness, if I may put it this way, of this United Nations. 40% of the budget of the United Nations was paid by the United States until recently, and there was a new decision to bring it back to 33%, and the decision was that no country in the world would contribute to such an organization for more than 33% of its budget. Now, at least half of the members of the United Nations are not paying anything at all. They are participating because this is an international forum and where everything is discussed, and we don't have any other alternative. So when you pay 40%, but now 33%, and you have the headquarters of this institution in New York, with all the how would I say, the supremacy that it brings for the hosting nation, it's inevitable that the United States has something more to say than the others in this context. And when you add to that that there are 5 nations, leading nations in the world, who are the winners of the Second World War and who have the right of veto, and in which they have the possibility of intervening in any case which is brought before the organization, and the last word belongs to them. So when the supremacy, the financial supremacy of the United States, plus the right of veto, of course, the answer is straightforward. United States, the organization is not working well. So it is not a just decision, just a decision-making body.
Yeah. So, Mr. Hold on to that thought there. I'm going to take this point to Mr. Asif Munier as well, and I'd like him to give us a critical analysis going through the lens of migration here and the lens of displacement. So when we talk about injustices and we talk about funding and how some voices have a greater role in the United Nations, how is that impacting the migration crisis?
In the same way as Ambassador Uluc was mentioning, that in terms of the decision making by the superpowers, for instance, the migration to Europe, or with the imminent Brexit, how it's impacting or going to impact all over Europe, and the decisions being made by the more powerful countries like Germany or France, and of course UK playing a role in that. And in terms of the contribution, of course, there is the deciding factor there. In terms of the refugee issues as well, for instance, the humanitarian support, humanitarian aid, for instance, for the Rohingya refugees, of course, for the 2019, the funding that is required, there is still a much shortfall, but the US government so far is the highest contributor for the humanitarian support. On the other hand, there is no visible initiative in terms of resolving the political crisis. If you look at, again, for the UN peacekeeping, I was just looking at something that was discussed at the UN level back in 2008, a critical review of the UN peacekeeping mechanism, and the fact that in terms of the troops, or actually the people who are commissioned for the UN peacekeeping, remember that the US is the highest contribution in terms of the financing, but I've seen one of the latest figures, there's only 40 persons from the US who are part of the UN peacekeeping force, whereas the majority of the deployment are from, some from Asia and from all over the, let's say, the less developed countries. The highest numbers are actually from the countries in Asia. If you say Bangladesh, India, and to some extent from Rwanda. So the troop deployment is one issue, but in terms of the decision making and with also the global scenario in terms of the global politics, which I mentioned about, for instance, NATO troops or the allied forces, the troops are now divided into different forces apart from the UN peacekeeping missions.
So, Mr. Uluc, back to you. Something that Mr. Asif Munier here was talking about, the UN peacekeeping body and operations that occur. What can you tell us about that? What is the primary role of these peacekeeping operations, and do you think they're being successful in their endeavors?
When it comes to the point of knowing whether they're successful or not, I would say no. Because in reality, all these forces are sent by different states, but they are not capable of fighting with their opponents, and they're not bringing peace. In reality, they are simply putting themselves in between the two lines and the two sides maybe are not attacking each other, but they are not helpful in solving the situation or in bringing peace in that respect.
So, Mr. Uluc,
it's not possible.
Yeah, so you're mentioning here they're not successful in bringing about peace. And this is a question I'm going to ask Mr. Maqsood Ahmed here. Do you agree with that opinion that they're not successful in bringing about meaningful long-term peace?
Okay, I think it's a kind of a mixed bag here.
Okay.
UN has been successful in certain missions, and I can name number of them like Angola, Namibia, Mozambique, Liberia, Uganda, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, Ivory Coast, Guatemala, East Timor. These are the success stories of the United Nations. But we have to see in the background now the kind of environment where the peacekeeping missions are being deployed now. Since I've been deploying these missions for 3 years in the United Nations, they have changed tremendously. Initially, it used to be interstate conflicts, that you have an agreement between the two states, and then you put the UN mission as an observer over there that who violates the peace agreements, and then report it back to the Security Council. Yeah. Now we are being deployed in an environment where there's hardly any peace to keep. We are almost in a war-like situation where intrastate conflicts are playing their part. You take the example of Libya, you take the example of Syria, you take the example of Congo, you go to Mali, you go to Central African Republic, there's hardly any peace to keep.
So if there is no peace to keep, what are these peacekeeping operations
That's what
doing
I'm coming to. The forces are being deployed to just bring some kind of a control onto violence which is going on there, to protect the lives of the people, and then give a chance to the political players that they assemble the parties together on a table to reach a political agreement.
Okay, so in the case of Syria here, when we know that there are so many players involved, who is the UN peacekeeping mission protecting? Which voice are they representing?
There's no peacekeeping mission in Syria as of now, and the reason is that the environment is so volatile and it's a war going on that you cannot deploy a peacekeeping mission over there.
So in cases where there is a complete lack of any semblance of peace or any sort of system, there are no peacekeeping operations?
There cannot be peacekeeping mission. The kind of violence has to be brought down to a level where any third country is ready to send their troops. Okay, but let me add over here. There is a UN presence. What we tell them is a political mission. It's a kind of humanitarian mission over there, but it's not a peacekeeping mission. The troops are not there to kind of enforce peace over there. So that's a little complicated thing. But what I'm trying to say is that it's a quite different environment where the peacekeeping are deployed. So when we judge the success or a failure of United Nations, we have to keep the environment in mind.
Yeah.
So they are controlling the damage, they are protecting the lives of the UN personnel as well as the civilians, but they are not resolving the issues because that lies in the political domain.
Okay, so let's go back to the main purpose of the United Nations, which is international security and international peace. When there is an outcry of human rights violations in places like Syria and Yemen, and you're saying that there isn't currently a peacekeeping operation in Syria because of the volatile conditions, what role is the United Nations playing there? Who is implementing some degree of measures that are making sure that the lives are being protected there?
Okay. What the political mission or the UN representative or the Secretary General is trying to do is they're trying to engage all the parties who are involved there to reach a consensus, some sort of agreement where the peacekeeping mission could be deployed, where they can do something. So see, in a war-like situation, no country would like to put their troops in that danger. It may be a third world country, or in any case, he mentioned that there are very less troops coming from the European and American countries.
Yep.
So that's a complication. But as I said, there are
But what about human rights violations? What is happening in regards to that? I understand that you're saying that key players need to come to the table, there needs to be a discussion, but we know there are reports coming out from there that there are some grave human rights violations.
Yeah.
What is happening in regards to that? What is the UN doing?
The UN, naturally, the United Nations Human Rights Commission is deployed. There are people over there who are monitoring, reporting the atrocities being committed by each of the players who is involved in Syria or Libya or whatever. But as per se, United Nations mission for peacekeeping is not deployed over there. It will be deployed at a point in time.
So we're getting figures, we're getting numbers, but we're not getting any palpable we're not getting a solution there to protect the people.
Yeah, as of now, there's no
So
solution.
is the United
in sight.
Nations failing in its primary
No, they're
goal?
trying it, but it's a difficult situation. I think it's not very easy kind of a situation. There are many players involved
So
in
it
that.
defeats the purpose of the United Nations if it fails to operate successfully in conflict zones such as Syria.
Well, you can say they fail in the first task. Actually, the task of the United Nations is to preempt. The conflict should not take place.
The primary role
responsibility.
has been established, that has been reiterated, is to maintain security and peace. And I'm going to take this to former Ambassador Uluc as well. Do you think, you have been hearing the line of questioning here, the debate, do you think that the United Nations has completely failed when it comes to conflict zones?
Well, there are some easier and some other harder cases in the world. For example, when I look back and I want to give you an example. In Srebrenica, for example, during the war, there have been more than 8,000 casualties, and the Dutch forces, the United Nations peacekeeping force, were not capable of intervening and ending up with this massacre, which has been brought before the international instances as a genocide in the end. For example, in Somalia, it was not successful, and the lives of many innocent Pakistani soldiers on the front line were lost. Now, what we are witnessing today is that many big countries, important countries, are not asking for the assistance of the United Nations peacekeeping forces, but they are intervening themselves directly. Take the case of France, for example, in Western Africa lately. I mean, they're all the time there, present there, and they are not going as a veto-having member of the United Nations. They are not applying to United Nations to bring peacekeeping forces to solve the problems in this field. So it all depends from which angle you approach the case. In Cyprus, there is, for example, a peacekeeping force, and it seems to be successful, but thanks to the presence of the Turkish military forces.
Yeah.
If they not been there, the problem would have been different.
Yeah.
So this is the first. Second point.
Mr. Uluc, hold on to that thought. I want to take a question to Mr. Asif Munier here while we're talking about the relevancy of the United Nations. Another question that came to my mind was that there was a global migration pact which was brought up by the United Nations, of which the US refused to sign it. Many prominent key European nations failed to sign it. And this was a pact that was supposed to be key recommendations as opposed to implementations. So I wonder here, when there is so much conflict regarding recommendations, and the primary purpose of the United Nations is to have these discussions and to reach some sort of global cooperation. In this light, do you feel like the United Nations has completely lost its relevancy?
No, I would say that, again, like I started off by saying, it's going through a transition phase with the global scenario changing. If you think about 10 years back, 15 years back, the trend of the migration scenario and the refugees was not the same. So the need for looking at new instruments, international instruments, for instance, beyond the Refugee Convention or beyond the Migration Convention, Migrant and Families Convention of 1992. And that also, which can incorporate the different ways and different kinds of migration. So temporary migration, permanent migration, diaspora, people sort of affected by conflict and the different new kinds of conflict that we see.
Yeah. So Mr. Asif Munier, since we're running out of time, I just want to pick up on the point that you mentioned here, something that you have reiterated before, is about the transition. You're saying that it's going through a transition. Where do you see this transition heading?
I think the UN members need to look and reflect what has worked and what has not just the UN peacekeeping, the role of the UN. Many of the international organizations are actually, celebrating or observing, 100 years, since the First World War. The UN peacekeeping is observing, or last year observed, it's 70 years. So it's time to look back that in the changing scenario of the world, do we need to look at new terms of references of these institutions, including, maybe not the Charter of the United Nations as a whole, but in terms of how it's manifested or how it's really applied for countries, looking back, that things have been, things like the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights since 1948. We can keep that there, but still look at how we apply it differently in a new phase. So that needs to be discussed in the coming days.
So, Mr. Uluc, I'm going to put the same last question to you. In addition to whatever Mr. Asif Munier has stated, what else do you think needs to be done to change the UN, United Nations body in order for there to be meaningful progress?
Since almost 30 years, the United Nations is working on a reform. But endless work, because it's not coming to a conclusion. When you have more than 194, 95 nations, and you have to start negotiations, but these negotiations are almost impossible because it's not possible to bring a conclusive situation which is good for everyone and all these nations. So since 30 years, the reform is not ending, and it's still continuing. The second thing, the United Nations needs a new funding system, because especially all these, the peacekeeping force problem, as well as the others, is based on the financial situation.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no money, and everybody is asking for self-contribution to end up with the conflicts, etc. It's not possible. So we need a reform. Just one word on one point that which is extremely important as far as I'm concerned, the terrorism. The United Nations is working on since almost 22 years on this question, and there is not yet a uniform definition of what terrorism is.
Yeah.
So the world is changing.
So,
and the United Nations.
Yeah, Mr. Uluc registered your points there, and the point you made there in regards to funding was a very strong point, something that all our guests have mentioned and alluded towards and have seen as a problem. Thank you so much, Lieutenant General Maqsood Ahmed, for joining us today. Thank you so much, Mr. Asif Munier, for joining us. Thank you so much, Mr. Uluc, for joining us. Thank you so much for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Goodbye and take care.